Hey there! This video is going to be a deep dive into the Nikon Z8's NRAW. And before we get into it, I just have to have a huge thank you to B&H Photo who lent me the Z8 to test review and make videos like this for all of you. Now, I buy most of my stuff from B&H, so if you are looking to pick up some gear, I highly recommend you check out B&H Photo. There are links in the description for not only the Z8, but all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So again, big thank you to B&H for making this possible. So the time of recording this, I just want to mention that I am using firmware version 2.01 on the Z8. So if you're watching this later and there is a new firmware, that's the firmware that I was using when I was recording this. Now, like I said, this is going to be a deep dive, but there's going to be a lot of test charts. So we're going to get super nerdy here. So hopefully you are up for that. But before I get into all that, I will first explain the raw options, how it works in the camera, and how to bring it into the computer and how to edit them. And I did find some issues with a lot of the raw stuff in the Z8, and I will get to that later on in this video. So first of all, there are two different flavors of raw in the Nikon Z8. There is Nikon's NRAW, and there's also ProRes RAW. Both are 12-bit. Now, to edit ProRes RAW, you need to use Final Cut Pro, but I'm going to focus on NRAW in this video, and I'll be editing in Davinci Resolve. I do also want to point out that all of the formats, the video formats in the Z8 are in a 16:9 ratio. There is no DCI or 17:9 option in the Z8. So diving into the menu, I just want to show you where some of these options are. If you go to the video recording menu and we scroll down to video file type, there are several different options in here. The first of which is the NRAW 12-bit. That's the main one that we're going to be talking about, and it's an NEV file. So when you bring it to your computer, you will see NEV. You may also see a proxy file, but NEV is the one that you want. There is the ProRes RAW HQ 12-bit, which we're not going to be talking about here. We're going to focus on NRAW. We also have ProRes 422 HQ 10-bit, which we will be talking about in this video. And then the last option here is in H.265 10-bit. Now, I do want to point out something that maybe a lot of people are not aware of here, that the H.265 10-bit is actually a 420 codec, not 422. It's also a long op codec. So if you want a 10-bit 422 codec that is not RAW, so some sort of compressed codec, you have to use the ProRes 422 HQ. So that will definitely be a big part of this discussion, but I just want to mention the H.265 10-bit is 420, not 422. So going back in the menu here, you can see there's NLog next to all the different file types, and you can change any of them, but we're going to focus on NRAW, of course, in this video. So if I press to the right, you can see there's two different options. There's NLog and SDR. So what I recommend is choosing NLog here because I think that's the better option. Now, I'm going to show you later on in the computer that it actually doesn't matter which one you choose because it's a raw format and it's just metadata and it tells Resolve what to do with the file right off the bat, but you can change it later. But just set it to NLog. I think that's the best option. Now, I do also want to mention how to expose NRAW. And since we'll be setting NRAW to record in NLog, you expose it the way you would expose NLog in any of the other modes, which if you're shooting for middle gray, like on a gray card, make sure you set your zebras to 95. I know it's kind of a weird number, but it is a scale from 0 to 255. So that is how I will be properly exposing NRAW in NLog on the Z8. All right, so here we are in Davinci Resolve, and I want to show you how to use an NRAW file. So we have an NRAW file here, and we're inside of the color page, and over here we have all of our color wheels. So if we go up here all the way to the left, there's this camera raw tab. So if we hit that, we can come into this new menu here, and you can see that a lot of the options are grayed out, and that's because we're using decode using project. So if you click on project, you have a few different options. One is camera metadata. Basically, this is the data that was recorded in the camera. So if you're ever curious about what the camera was set to when you recorded it, set it to camera metadata and it will show you all those values in here. The one we want to click on so we can change some of these settings is going to be clip. So as you can see here, there is a bunch of information that opened up that we can change. So first of all, right now we recorded this in NLog. Like I said, we were going to record in NLog. NLog is actually in the Rec 2020 color space. So over here, you can make these conversions right away. So for example, if I want to change this to Rec 709 in NLog because I edit in a 709 timeline, now I can come over here and I can do a color space transform, or I can come over here and I can just grade this log footage sort of however I want, right? You can do that. But if we go back over here, you can also do a conversion right away. So Rec 709, we can make this Rec 709 and boom, it's colored in. So you can make all those corrections right here. You come over here, change the color temperature and all this other stuff. And this is using the raw data from the NRAW file. Now, one more thing that's really cool, which I don't know if is in other different RAW formats from other manufacturers. Now, this was shot with the Nikon 24 to 72.8, and what's really cool is there is this button here to click for lens distortion. So as I click it on and off, you can see it applies the lens distortion correction that would normally be recorded if you were not shooting in RAW. Now, this is cool because I'm using a lens that obviously talks to the camera. I'm sure this isn't with every lens out there and probably is only with Nikon lenses, but that's really cool that you can have a RAW file and still be able to apply lens corrections. That's really rare. I haven't seen that before. Now, the other thing you can correct here is the lens vignette, which obviously you can set to correct automatically when you are shooting in non-RAW, but you have the option to do that here. And I assume that it probably uses the data from the camera and the lens to know what to do here to get that to be really accurate. So that's pretty cool. So now I want to show you what the difference when you shoot in the camera with the NRAW set to N-Log or SDR, like I was talking about earlier. So I have two clips side by side here so you can see them. This one right here on the right is going to be the one that was shot in SDR. And this one on the right on the timeline here is the one on the left. That's the one that was shot in the N-Log. And you can see they look very different. This one is log looking and this one is all colored in. So if we go over here to the RAW tab, you can see for the one that was recorded in SDR, this one was shot in 709, 709. And that's why it looks colored in. That's the SDR look. Now if we click on this other one here, this one was shot in 2020 N-Log, like I was just showing you before. That's how it comes out of the camera and into Resolve when you shoot in N-Log. So what's really neat is if I come over here and I change this to clip so I can change this, let's change this to the same settings, so 2020 and N-Log. That is how it's shot when you shoot in N-Log and NRAW. And now you can see these two clips are exactly the same. So it doesn't really matter if you select N-Log or you select SDR. You can change them later in post, so it doesn't really matter. But I just want to show you the difference here in post. One more thing that's interesting about this is back to that other clip that I was just showing you. If you go under the white balance, this is as shot. So I had this set to the daylight white balance setting in the camera, and it's reading a color temperature of 5210. But if I actually change this to daylight in the RAW tab, it changes it to 5500 with a shift of 10. Which is interesting. And looking at the waveform, that actually looks a little bit more accurate. So not really sure what's going on with that, but when you shoot sunny white balance in the camera, it actually reads 5210. So just want to share that weird little quirk with you as well. I do want to mention that there are a few features that are not available when you're shooting in NRAW, and a lot of these do make sense. Active D lighting, high ISO noise reduction, diffraction compensation, skin softening, and electronic VR. I also want to mention that the HDMI output is only 1080p. So if you do need a HDMI output for monitoring, of course, this camera does not put out RAW over HDMI, but if you need to hook up a monitor, either leave the HDMI output to auto or set it to 1080p. If you actually choose a 4K or 8K output from HDMI, it won't display anything over HDMI. So either leave it on auto or set it to 1080p. All right, so the next thing I need to discuss with all of you is going to be the different crop modes that are going on inside the Z8 because it has a lot to do with a lot of the cool things that are going on with RAW in this camera. So there's also some interesting nomenclature. If you don't already know this, if you're shooting full frame on the Z8, it's called FX, and if you're shooting in crop mode, it's called DX. So let's start with full frame. Now, usually for a full frame stills camera, it has a resolution for its sensor that's 36 by 24 millimeters. So that's in a ratio of 3:2. Now, the sensor of the Nikon Z8 is actually 35.9 by 23.9 millimeters. So pretty close to that 36 by 24. Now, if you take a look at this chart here, it does say 35.9 by 20.2 millimeters, and that's because the other numbers is for photo, reading the full sensor, but this is for video, and it records the full width, 35.9, but it crops the top and the bottom to get from a 3:2 ratio to a 16:9 ratio. So there are two different crop modes in the Z8. There is a DX crop mode, which is the Super 35 or APS-C crop, and there's also a 2.3 times crop. So I'll explain what the crop factors actually are, and I'll explain how to calculate them. But first, let's go into the camera, and I can show you where all this stuff is, and you can see where the resolutions are. So we were just talking about the video file type, but if you go down to the next one, frame size, frame rate, there's a lot of different options in here. So the first one is the main one. That's the 8.3K FX full frame, it's 8256 by 4644. Now, if we scroll down to the DX modes here, if we look at the 5.4K 24, you see it says DX, so that's the APS-C or Super 35 crop. You have 5392 by 3032. And lastly, the 3.8K, you have that 2.3 times crop at 3840 by 2160. So let's start off by talking about the DX crop, and we'll talk about how to calculate that. So the resolution, we're going to be looking at just the horizontal resolution because the vertical can be calculated based on the aspect ratio, like 16:9 or 3:2. You can use the resolution, or you can also use the sensor width to figure out what the crop factors are. So based on the resolution, we're going to take the full frame resolution of 8256, and we're going to divide by the horizontal resolution for the crop mode, which is 5382, and we get 1.534. So there's also this chart where you can see the sensor sizes for the different crops, and for the DX, it's 23.5 by 13.2. So we could do this in terms of sensor width. We take 35.9 divided by 23.5, we get 1.528. So there's a little bit of rounding going on in a lot of those numbers in terms of the sensor width and stuff. So let's just call it 1.53. That's pretty easy to remember. And if you can't remember 1.53, 1.5 is plenty close enough. So there's that. Now the next mode is really interesting because there's actually an error in this camera, and I did let Nikon know about this, so hopefully they fix this. But the 2.3 times crop is actually 2.15. So based on the resolution, it's 8256 divided by 3840, which is 2.15. And then taking a look at the chart for the sensor widths again, for the 2.3 times crop, we have 16.7 by 9.4 millimeters. So if we take 35.9 and divide by 16.7, we get 2.15. And to verify that 2.15 crop, let's take a look at an actual example here. Over on the left, we have a frame that was shot with the 2.3 times crop mode, and the camera in the exact same location on a tripod over on the right-hand side was shot with the full frame mode. So if we take this image here and we crop in to, let's say, their 2.3 times crop, you can see that it does not match. We are too zoomed in. It does not match the 2.3 times crop mode on the left. Let's change this to the one that we calculated, 2.15, and you can see that the images match. So there you go. 2.15 is the actual crop factor for the 2.3 times crop mode. So now that we know the different crop factors, there's a few different modes in the camera that we can talk about. First of all, the 8.3K RAW, which I mentioned in full frame, is up to 60 frames per second. And that's going to be a full sensor with one-to-one readout. So there's no line skipping, pixel binning, oversampling. It's just pulling each pixel off and registering it and recording it in a RAW format. There's also a 4.1K format. So inside the camera here, you can see, maybe you saw me skip over it earlier, 4.1K FX, and it's 4128 by 2322, and you can go from 24 frames per second all the way up to 120 frames per second. So this is really fascinating to me and caught my eye very quickly when I started going through the camera, because I haven't seen a camera being able to have the resolution and still have a RAW mode. Most cameras, when you lower the resolution, it has to crop into the sensor to get a one-to-one readout with the pixels. So I actually reached out to Nikon about this because I was really confused how you could still have full frame but have half the resolution in the horizontal and vertical direction. And they told me that it was actually oversampled in the 24, 25, and 30p. And it's actually not oversampled above that, but they couldn't tell me exactly what was going on, line skipping, pixel binning, all that kind of stuff. It's some proprietary thing. So it supposedly is oversampled up to 30 frames per second. We will double check this. This is a very interesting format. It has a lot of potential because of the different file sizes. So take a look at the bit rates here. For example, the 8.3K full frame high quality NRAW in 24 frames per second is 2,780 megabits per second. And that 4.1K full frame in high quality NRAW in 24 frames per second is 700 megabits per second. That is 1/4 of the data of the 8.3K NRAW. And this actually makes sense because if we're recording a resolution that's half the number of pixels in the horizontal and vertical direction, that's actually 1/4 the amount of information being stored. So there's a huge savings in terms of data. So this has huge potential for a lot of filmmakers out there to save a lot of data and still get a full frame RAW format. So I'm very intrigued by that, but there are some issues with this, so we will talk about that. Next, we have the 5.4K DX crop. That's the 1.53 times Super 35 or APS-C crop. And we can record that from 24 frames per second up to 60 frames per second. And lastly, we have the 3.8K, which is that, I'll say in quotes, 2.3 times crop, but it's really 2.15. And we can record that in 100 or 120 frames per second. Now, it's really interesting because when I looked in the manual, it does show a raw 3840 by 2160 in 5060p, but that is clearly not available inside the camera. So a little bit of a mistake in the manual there, or it's just not included in the camera for some reason. The next thing to talk about in this camera is the video quality of the NRAW. There are two options. There's high quality and normal. So we'll take a look and see the difference there. But basically the normal is 1/2 the bitrate of the high quality. So for example, in the 8.3K full frame, the high quality is 2,780 megabits per second and the normal is 1,390 megabits per second. So half of that. So before we get on to looking at the nerdy test charts, I just want to mention a couple things about the tests I conducted. I used my trusty Sigma Art 28mm lens for most of the tests, and when I'm testing different size crop factors, I will actually just move the camera to get similar framing. So with all of these images, I brought them into the computer, converted them to the Rec 709 N-Log using Color Space Transform and Resolve, and then I graded them by hand, just adjusting the exposure and contrast and saturation, but I did not touch the colors whatsoever. I could have used the standard conversions, but a lot of them are kind of too punchy and don't really match up perfectly for how I want to test them. So I just graded them by hand and actually just copied and pasted the grade from one to all the other ones so they're exactly the same. So taking a look here at the 8.3K's 24 frames per second high quality mode versus the normal quality mode, right off the bat they do look really similar, and zooming in, I don't see any difference here in terms of the detail, sharpness, or the noise. And zooming back out, you can see that maybe there's a little bit of a difference here in the shadows. They look a little bit warmer on the normal quality mode, but overall, these two modes look really, really similar. And I think you're not really gonna see much of a difference between these two unless you're pushing the color grade really hard in post and you're really taking advantage of the higher bit rate in the high quality mode. But from this basic test, and I think for most of us out there that are using this, I think you're probably not gonna see that much of a difference in terms of the overall quality between the high quality and the normal quality modes. Next, we'll have a look at the 8.3K's 24 frames per second versus 60 frames per second. Overall, they look really similar. And zooming in, you can see that these look really similar in terms of detail, sharpness, and noise, which makes complete sense. And zooming back out, you can see that the colors look really, really similar between these two. And the reason why I say it makes a lot of sense is that in both of these modes, in 24 and 60 frames per second, these are one-to-one readouts in the raw modes. So we should get similar performance in every single way. And taking a look at rolling shutter, in the 24 frames per second, I got a reading of 14.5 milliseconds. And in 60 frames per second, I also got a reading of 14.5 milliseconds. So we're basically getting the same performance in terms of everything in the 8.3K in 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second because they're all gonna be a one-to-one readout in those raw modes. All right, so next let's get into looking at the 4.1K full frame mode. And that was the one that is a quarter of the bit rate as the 8.3K full frame raw mode, which is why I'm so interested in it. Now, I do have to say that there are some issues with this, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But for all these tests, we're going to be using the 8.3K RAW as sort of our baseline for all these comparisons. So taking a look here at the 8.3K RAW versus the 4.1K RAW in 24 frames per second, right off the bat, you can definitely see there's a color difference. Zooming in here, I think there is a little bit of an advantage for the 8.3K RAW in terms of detail and sharpness, even though this isn't a 4K timeline and the 4.1K is supposed to be oversampled. And zooming back out, looking at the colors, you can definitely see a difference in the shadows. There's sort of a bluish greenish cast going on in the shadows. So this is really interesting to me, and I, of course, want to take a deeper dive into taking a look and seeing what's going on in these different modes, and we'll take a look at a couple different tests. The first thing I'll take a look at here is going to be the dynamic range between these two modes. And like usual, one of the quickest ways that I can test dynamic range, especially when comparing either two cameras or two different modes, is where I stand in a dark room next to a bright window, I expose for the highlights, and then take a look at the shadows and see what's going on. So taking a look here at the 8.3K against the 4.1K, the highlights look really similar looking out through the window, but the big difference here is going to be in the shadows. And taking a look at the shadows and the noise, you'll see both in my face and on my shirt that there is a whole lot more chroma noise, and it's kind of blocky and green, and I think it definitely takes away from a little bit of the dynamic range on the 4.1K. Now this is fairly interesting to me because I saw some of this blocky green noise in some of my earlier tests in other videos, which I'll leave linked down below in terms of dynamic range and low light on the Z8. But I definitely see a big difference here in terms of that chroma noise and in the shadows. And this is really fascinating to me because these are both full width readouts. These are full frame modes, and that 4.1K is supposed to be oversampled from the 8.3K. And usually when you oversample, it compresses the noise and looks better. So I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I definitely think the 8.3K looks a lot better. The next thing we'll take a look at here is the sensor readout speed, which will help us determine the rolling shutter performance. And usually when you are oversampling an image, it will take a little bit longer because it has to process that data before it gets stored. So taking a look at the 8.3K 24 frames per second, I got 14.5 milliseconds. And also the 4.1K full frame and 24 frames per second, I also got 14.5 milliseconds, which is pretty weird because like I said, when you're oversampling, this should increase the sensor readout speed and having a worse rolling shutter performance. But they're the same here. And keep in mind that the 8.3K is a 1-to-1 readout versus the 4.1K is supposed to be oversampled. So I'm not really sure what's going on here. All right, moving on with the tests. And this one will compare the 8.3K 24 frames per second versus the 4.1K 60 frames per second. I see a little bit of a difference in the shadows, and zooming in here, you can see that the 8.3K is sharper, which makes sense because the 4.1K 60 frames per second is not oversampled. And zooming back out here, I definitely see the shadows are maybe a little bit warmer here on the 60 frames per second. Now let's compare the 4.1K in 24 frames per second versus 60 frames per second. And you can definitely see a difference here in terms of the colors. Now zooming in here, the 4.1K is going to be a little bit sharper because it is oversampled, where the 60 frames per second is not. And we should definitely expect that. And zooming back out, you can definitely see a difference of colors here because the 4.1K shadows are a lot different with the color cast. So the first thing, I always wonder if there is something wrong with my camera, if my copy is different than everyone else that's out there. So what I did was I've been chatting with Cam Mackey, who's also been testing out the Z8, and he also saw an issue with that 4.1K 24 frames per second in RAW, and he documented that in a recent video. So I will leave a link to that video down in the description below. You should definitely go check that out too. But there's definitely something weird going on with that 4.1K RAW in 24 frames per second. In terms of rolling shutter in these higher frame rates, we should expect to see a quicker sensor readout or better rolling shutter performance in 50, 60 frames per second and up, because at that point, the oversampling is turned off, which means it's faster to read out the sensor. And so in my testing, the 4.1K full frame in 60 frames per second got 4.9 milliseconds, and the 120 frames per second got also 4.9 milliseconds. Again, this is a lot faster because we are not oversampling, and 4.9 milliseconds is really good rolling shutter performance. So that's really cool to see that you can get a really quick readout on the 60 and 120 frames per second. Just a couple more for completion's sake here. We have the 8.3K 24p versus the 4.1K 60p. They look very similar, but the 8.3K is sharper. Then taking a look at the 24p versus the 120p. Again, they look very similar here, but the 8.3K is sharper. And lastly, comparing the 60p to the 120p, they look almost identical here in terms of detail, sharpness, noise, and color. All right, so after all those tests and all those comparisons, what can we conclude about that 4.1K full frame RAW mode? First of all, that oversampled 4.1K full frame mode in 24 frames per second has a weird color shift that's different from pretty much every other mode and frame rate. I'd probably recommend avoiding that mode because of that color shift. Now, the 4.1K 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second is not oversampled, and that's why it's different from that 24 frames per second. So it has less sharpness and a little bit more noise as expected, but it has a much quicker sensor readout speed for better rolling shutter performance, which is fantastic. So this pretty much sums up all of the full frame RAW modes. Let's start taking a look at some of the crop modes, and we will start with the 5.4K DX mode. That's the Super 35 APS-C 1.53 times crop. So looking at the 8.3K 24p against the 5.4K 24p, overall, these look really similar to each other. And zooming in, we get the 8.3K is sharper, of course, has more resolution, and the 5.4K is a little bit noisier, of course, because it's using less of the sensor, so we should see some more noise there. But overall, they look really similar in terms of colors And of course, because we're using a smaller part of the sensor, we are gonna get less sharpness and a little bit more noise. In terms of rolling shutter, the 5.4K 24 frames per second, I measured at 9.4 milliseconds, and the 60 frames per second was also 9.4 milliseconds, which is pretty good. And lastly, just for completion's sake, we'll compare the 5.4K against the 3.8K, and the results here, like you would expect, the 5.4K, it has more resolution and less noise than the 3.8K does, because like with all other cropping going on here, we see that the higher size of the sensor is going to give us more detail and less noise, but they look very similar otherwise. So lastly, in terms of rolling shutter on the 3.8K 120 frames per second, I got 6.7 milliseconds, which is a very quick readout. So now that we went through all those different comparisons with crop modes and all that stuff, let's take a few minutes to talk about the ProRes HQ. Now, like I said earlier on in the video, if you were looking for a compressed 10-bit 422 codec in the Z8, you have to use ProRes HQ, because the only other 10-bit option is the H.265, and that is a 420 codec. So this is super important. I do want to also mention here that if you're shooting in the non-RAW mode, so the ProRes HQ or the 10-bit H.265, there is noise reduction built in and you cannot control it. If you want to control the noise reduction, then you can shoot in the SDR mode in the H.265 10-bit or some of the 8-bit modes, and there shouldn't be any noise reduction in any of the RAW modes. So keep in mind about noise reduction when we're looking at these comparisons. So using our baseline 8.3K RAW full frame versus the 4K full frame ProRes here, the two images look pretty similar. There's a little bit of difference in the noise, but the detail and sharpness is better on the 8.3K as expected. But the noise in the ProRes is a little bit more blocky and a little bit more smeary. And this comes from the noise reduction in the camera that you cannot control. Overall, the images do look pretty similar, but there is definitely a difference in the noise patterns. Take a look at the dynamic range between these two. I think they are pretty similar. Overall, I think they probably have roughly the same amount of dynamic range, but the difference here is going to be in the noise, like I just mentioned earlier. Zooming in, if you look at the noise on my shirt there, the ProRes has that blockier and more smeary look to it, and I prefer the NRAW's noise pattern. It's a lot finer. Also, the colors I think are better on the NRAW. In terms of rolling shutter, I got 14.5 milliseconds for the ProRes, which is exactly the same as the 8.3K RAW. So generally, a big advantage to shooting in RAW is the ability to change the white balance non-destructively in post when you're shooting in RAW. So that could be a big difference here between shooting in RAW versus shooting in ProRes. So we'll have to take a look at that and see if it actually is that much of an advantage. So I did a quick test here, and I shot both the 8.3K RAW and the 4K ProRes here in the studio under a daylight light, and I set the cameras to sunny white balance. Then what I did was I didn't change the light, but I just changed the white balance setting to tungsten in the camera, and then I correct it in post. So let's take a look here. All right, so starting off here with our baseline, this is the 8.3K 24 frames per second against the 4K ProRes. You can see they look pretty similar here, set to sunny white balance. There's a little bit of a difference in terms of the colors. And this here is when I set the white balance to tungsten inside the camera. So of course, the images look really cool, but the colors are pretty different. Now, when I go to correct these in the NRAW, I'm gonna use the temperature settings in the RAW tab, and for the ProRes, I'm using the color temperature slider in the color grading tools, and you can see the NRAW gets a lot closer to the original image. Now, what was really interesting is when I compare the NRAW shot at sunny and the one that was shot at tungsten and corrected, even with the same settings in RAW, I could not get them to match each other. So to me, this is not perfect, which makes me think that this RAW is not like a true RAW that you'd see in something like a Red camera. Like I said, changing the white balance in post should be non-destructive, but it actually is here. So it's not a full advantage you get out of using RAW. Now, what are some of the advantages of shooting in RAW over ProRes? Well, first of all, the noise is much better in the RAW because you can't control the noise reduction in the ProRes. It is baked in, and I think the noise looks a lot better in the RAW. And of course, you could apply your own noise reduction to post with your own settings and make it look a lot better. Also, the ability to change the white balance is not perfect in the RAW, but it is a lot better than it is in the ProRes. So what are the advantages of ProRes? Well, mainly it's going to be the file size. ProRes 422 HQ in the 4K mode is 707 megabits per second, which is about half of the normal quality 8.3K RAW and a quarter of the size of the high quality 8.3K RAW. So if you want a compressed 10-bit 422 codec, then you only have one option in the Z8. That's going to be your ProRes 422 HQ, because the H.265 10-bit, like I said earlier, is a 420 codec. So after all this testing and talking, what are my takeaways? First of all, the 8.3K RAW is the best quality you can get out of this camera, no surprise. I would avoid that 4.1K full frame mode in 24 frames per second because of the color shift that's going on there, but the 60 and 120 frames per second looked really good and have that quick readout. If you want a compressed 10-bit 422 codec, then you should definitely shoot the ProRes 422 HQ because it is your only option for a compressed codec. If you want 12-bit and the best image quality, of course, shoot that 8.3K RAW. It looks great up to 60 frames per second. All right, so lastly, here are my closing thoughts. There are a few things that I would like to see fixed in this camera, and I do think a lot of them, but probably not all of them, could be taken care of via firmware. I would like to see a more usable compressed 10-bit 422 codec in this camera like we get with a lot of the other mirrorless cameras on the market. They could either give us more flavors of ProRes like ProRes 422 or ProRes LT, but in reality, I would like to see an H.265 10-bit 422 option because this is pretty standard nowadays in other mirrorless cameras, especially in this price range. That 4.1K oversampled full frame RAW mode could be super cool, and I'm still not sure how that even works, but you still get the RAW functionality and a quarter of the bit rate. So that would be something I'd really like to see them fix that and make the colors more accurate. I would also like to see the RAW in this camera behave more like RAW so I could change the white balance non-destructively in post because it didn't do that for me when I was pushing the white balance really hard. The sensor in the Z8 is really powerful and that 8.3K RAW image is fantastic. Nikon needs to iron out some of these issues and this camera will be even better, and I can't wait to see future firmware updates for this camera and future iterations of the Z8 and the Z9. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.